So, herzlich willkommen, schön sind alle da zu dieser dritten NCCFN-Conversation oder Gespräch. Und heute ist es eben auch im Rahmen der Kulturlandsgemeinde, wo ja das Thema Heimat hat, und wir haben das Thema Lokal, global heute und das zusammen vertiefen. Zusammen heisst eben wirklich, also wir, ich werde nachher auch alle noch vorstellen, aber auch ihr sind jederzeit eingeladen, Fragen stellen, Gedanken zu teilen. Also ja, man kann das auch am Schluss machen, aber man kann es wirklich auch während dem reagieren. And now I switch to English, since we do have also international guests, or not that local, I must say. Very welcome also to you here in Teufen in the exhibition Applied Utopia for our third talk we are having, and about the topic local global. And this time it's also part of the festival Kulturlandsgemeinde, which is taking part downstairs and in the whole house. And our topic today is global local, and Kulturlandsgemeinde has the topic home, so this also maybe fits together. And we will begin together for approximately 45 minutes, and also the guests, we are all guests and invited to participate and share thoughts and react on what we are talking about. So present with us today is Tanver Ahmed. She teaches fashion communication and race at Central St. Martin's College in London. And she traveled by train from London yesterday via France. And in our pre-talk, she told me about her research work, which includes also topics like decolonization fashion. So it will be fascinating to hear about that later in the context of global and local. Next, we have Peet Pienaar joining us, and he works between graphic and fashion design between Cape Town and Geneva. And in our pre-discussion, he mentioned that he's currently focusing on the intersection of sport and design on the continent of Africa. And this will also be interesting to hear about the impact of Eurocentric design thinking from designers who work in regions away from Europe. Our third guest, we also have Aurelia Markwalder with us. She works as a printmaker and type designer based in Leipzig, but originally very local. You grew up here in St.Gallen, and has also worked as a chef in the past. So in our pre-discussion, we talked about how material also needs local production. And among other things, she can share also firsthand with us what it means to move a 7-ton printing machine. So lots of material involved there. And then we always have a surprise guest presented by NCCFN, which this time is Dimitri Reist, part of the network, and so very involved also in the topics and also in the exhibition, in the context, how this happened. So I'm quite sure that you can give us also a lot of insight about the topic local and global and the thoughts we are having. So I would like first to start with Tanveer, since you traveled, as I said, from London yesterday. What are your really recent thoughts on local global, since you were driving from London through France here to St. Gallen and now even Teufen? So you have a very local environment in London, and now kind of discover in a very fast period here this local area. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation today. It's been a real pleasure to join you today, to join everyone here today. Well, I mean, one thing I did this morning, I went to the Textile Museum in St.Gallen, and it was such a pleasure when you see regional museums that show going so in depth into a local form of design, so the lace making, which was absolutely amazing to see. And I think that it's really important that we keep those things alive and we look at these very particular local traditions that I was asking you about, based in your family, for example. And so I think these things are really important, but at the same time I was also talking about how we think about the global now through a decolonial lens. So my own research has been looking at how we think about colonial histories. So one thing that was missing in the wonderful museum was how the cotton got to Switzerland. Who made the cotton? It's not grown locally. So where's all that absence, and how, particularly in this wonderful exhibition, how we're looking at these opposites. So we see this very local tradition, we see that it's global, but we don't also, the absence of that history is it's important. It should be there, it should be centred. And what's wonderful to see here is I really like seeing the cardboard boxes, to see that global supply chain, to understand who packs it. You can feel the tangible, aspect of somebody putting the tape, the plastic tape on the box, but who made that cotton? Where does it come from? So I suppose those sorts of things come to mind, travelling from London and seeing the rich history here.
Talking of such rich history, you, Aurelia, you work in Leipzig, also where with really printing and with books, and Leipzig also has this history.
Yes, Leipzig was before the war in the 20s the most important place for books next to New York. And it has a big tradition of all applied industries with printing, so books, type foundries, book binderies. And actually now everything is gone. So I think the book fair is the only thing which is already there. In the big fabric houses, there were only rich people living in their loft flats there, but genau. And I run a letterpress workshop together with Louise Bartels there. Some of the machines, I already had them here. And the whole workshop has about, about 7 tons, I would say. Genau, and this is something which makes my work very local, because I need the space there to work. I can't go in a coffee shop with my laptop and sit there and do my designs. I really need to be there to work. So this is, so maybe my thought about being local, and also what you said, so keeping up a tradition. Of course, the question also with this Sticken, what was it? Embroidery, genau. So we always ask ourselves, how can we take this old tradition and transfer it into present?
Yeah.
So, this is a thought which I have in my work a lot.
And this working locally, you work in Cape Town, but also for like a really global market. How does that? What are your experiences with this? Maybe also just working from this really local side for a market which maybe also has different languages and.
Yeah. So I work. We have a surf brand, and the reason we have a surf brand is because it goes in the hybrid of like intersection of like West and Africa. And what we found is that Africa has enormous influence at the moment on a global stage. You see what's happening with music, you see what's happening with sports players playing everywhere in the world, but their own countries. And you're seeing a lot of interest in Africa. Africa is also playing a massive role in politics at the moment. And I think all those things are really coming to the surface. But what we find is that because of a lot of politics and because Africa was always excluded from design and not being incorporated in design, it's been completely left in a place where it actually now can't produce their own design in a way that they would want to. Because if a designer from Ghana, for instance, wants to work in a Ghanaian style on a global stage, but no one will buy it because it will be seen as appropriation to buy it. So in that way, a lot of designers have been excluded from their own design. So we're trying to find ways that African designers can still tell their own stories on a global scale, like music or sport. So, and that's the kind of things that we're trying to work with and trying to change.
Thank you. And Dimitri, that's now really like the first thoughts we're having, but are you, having worked on those topics and having the local global topic as one of the main parts of the exhibition, what are your first thoughts hearing that? Are there connections to what you were in?
Well, first of all, very thankful and honored to be here in this round. I think like we have not only global, local as these kind of counterparts that we put next to each other, but also fake original or people material. And I think we have been working as a group on these topics for quite a long time because obviously and that's why in the middle you see the word shadiness. I think we are interested in the in-between or the mix of these, let's say maybe in your first impression you would say it's like contrary or in the oppositions. But we are very strongly like engaged in finding out where we actually stand. Of course, it's always both. And I think hearing the three next to me now talking about it, it already implies this, that we can't like distinct between local or global. This kind of discussion that happens quite often also here in Switzerland, I guess, where it's about, do you want to be local or do you want to global? And I think we are much more interested in the reality, and this reality is somewhere in between, and what it actually means to be global and local at the same time. So I think this is kind of the opening discussion that we wanted to bring here, and I think that's why we are talking today.
Hearing about this local, global, good, bad, also like black, white, no, it's gray, you say, but still thinking about advantages or disadvantages of global, local production. What are your thoughts about that? You, for example, said before of the packages, you can feel someone who has closed that box.
Yeah.
There are people involved in that.
Yeah, and I mean, with fashion, so much is about the global supply chain, but so much of fashion is spent focusing on just the design and excluding all the other parts of the supply chain. So in my own research, it's about how do we make sure that those parts of the design process are also included in conversations rather than just neglected. And, you know, the contribution particularly of brown young women in places like Bangladesh to making clothes is so integral. You know, I often teach about the history of the sewing machine, because none of us would be dressed without sewing machines. You know, none of us wear handmade clothes, very few people do. And yet we don't, most fashion designers, students of fashion, we don't know where the sewing machine came from, how it's contributed to exploiting these young brown women. And we should know about all of those parts of the design process. So I think this, you know, what you're saying, Dimitri, about the you know, kind of these spaces in between us, is so important. It kind of gets to the heart of what we're thinking about, because we tend to always just think about one or the other, the designer or the exploited person, and yet there's so much richness in between. And how do we start people talking about that and kind of reinventing, I suppose, the design process? What happens if you start with the person who's made things and forget about the designer for a bit, you know, subvert it?
Yeah, I think for us it's very important that the people who make the product have some connection to what the product stands for as well. So for us, it's very important that if you make an African product in Africa, about Africa, designed by Africans, that the people make it also feels like they're part of that process and understanding where it's going, and it's not just something that's passing through and you don't know where it's coming from and where it's going, and there's never a discussion with you about what you're making. But also in the sort of like making sure that whatever that process is that it's communicated, but also a fair trade between what's happening, and it's not about like who's doing it for the cheapest. So for us, it's like, how do you sell something globally that creates jobs on a local level, but those jobs that you create on a local level can't be exploited. It needs to be really fair. And then being competitive with other brands that are doing it in the complete opposite. And I think those are the complexities. So you have other brands that would just go and make it in the cheapest Bangladeshi factory and using sweatshops, and would charge you absolutely nothing and would sell it at the same price as you, but the difference in profit. So I think the systems of like business behind fashion needs to also be questioned in those kind of things. And I think that's the kind of questions that we need to see is when we buy something, what are we supporting? I think that's the main thing. Transparency.
Yeah. So I also asked myself, how is it possible when you grow as a company? So as long as you stay small, you can control things. Where do you get your paper, your ink, the design process? But when it gets bigger, how do you manage? To control or label the things, the material you need. So this is also why I think it's good to stay small and it's not my interest to expand. No.
It is true, and I think also the contemporary sort of realities in African context, sometimes you want to keep something small, but then sometimes the need for jobs is so extreme that you need to create things that would actually like put bread on the table for people. So it's like playing with that kind of stuff, but not being exploitative, but actually making sure that people actually like have living from that. But sometimes you need to go big in order to look at those issues. And I think that's the thing we have. You can't just sustain 5 people if you can probably sustain 100 people.
One idea to make you independent would maybe also be to keep things or make things digital, to have like not being in a place but be somewhere in the cloud or whatever. Aurelia, I'm asking that because you tried something more or less to have like a digital way for your type. It was like an online lead setting print shop. What were the experiences there? Was that the other thing is that keep it small? How did the digital way go?
I think we were really fascinated about the idea to make this heavy weight, so to transfer the heavy type founded in Latin, to transfer in this light internet media. So we founded More Impression, and with the approach that you can set your card online. So it's kind of, I don't know if you have any idea of letterpress, if you ever saw how it looks like. You have a type case and there are these little letters in. So of course the difference to a digital typeface with these analog letters is that you run out of letters, so the amount of letters is not endless. So we calculated every letter we have, and then when you go online and you type in your text and you run out of A's, then there will be a warning. And also the scalable, you can't scale a type, there are fixed sizes, which for some people it's a limitation. I think limitation can also be an advantage. And so for us, we were interested in this transfer thing, but I think it will not be used that much because you don't get a preview when you're online and you do the design with the template. And I think it's also difficult for people to make this abstraction in their heads. And mostly when I show my work, when people can touch it and take it in their hands and feel it, then they are really enthusiastic about it. But when it comes to this, I don't know, verkopfte digital label, then it's, I don't know if everyone can does that step too. So, but it's also hard to explain when you can't see it. So actually,
But it was an experiment, so you not chose to put everything on that digital. You're still in the physics.
No, we have some designs where you can, you enter as an edit, but we didn't count all our letters. That would be too much. Yeah.
I was just thinking about limitation in the sense that maybe just to come back to the exhibition, we often work with overproduced material or waste material, dead stock, overproduction. And I think that's also interesting because, for example, for this project at the football club in Bern, young boys approached us they had like a fabrication problem with the brand Nike, with their supplier, and so normally Nike just offer to send everything back and to make it new. And we kind of got into discussion because we knew someone, Nina and I, or we as a group knew someone who was interested to maybe use this dead stock. And I think it was it was interesting to kind of work with the club that has a kind of a scale up, not a global, but definitely national idea of how clothes should function and how their supply should function. At the same time, we as a group who produce it at the end ourselves in the atelier and kind of created our own workshop, and also had to find out that it's very hard to create productions in a sense of 300 pieces, because either you make it very small and your own, and it's very unique, or you produce in high amounts, which is then industrial, very strongly implied, or installed. So, but in between, it's not so easy to find this kind of like collaborative stuff. So at the end, we made it ourselves, and we had to work with the limitations we had, and that was also a very good learning process for us to see, what can you actually do as a brand that wants to try to stay sustainable in the whole, what you said, Tanvi, from the beginning of the fabric that you get until the end product, and in between the process, how to stay there also in this kind of sustainable way, not only in ecological way, but also in the way you care with people that you employ and pay for the work. So that was extremely interesting to see how difficult it actually is to set something up when it's a bit in between very small or very big, and
Are there examples, maybe also from your students or from fashion brands that managed to find a way between this global and local, the topic of this being small and being able to control the chain or the circle even better?
Yeah, it's obviously it is a real challenge, and I think one thing as well made me think of what you were saying as well about the end of life of the design as well. So that other design disciplines think about the end of life right at the beginning. Fashion doesn't. We don't really, once somebody's got their garment, they can go off and do what they want. But I think laws are coming through. I believe certainly in France and the UK might be doing this as well, where you're going to have to explain what happens to anything that's designed at the end of its life. So that will make you think about how many seams you can put into a garment, what thread you're using. If you're using polycotton, it can't be recycled. It's a mixture of the natural and the synthetic. So these things become really important. And as I said, kind of challenges. I'm trying to think. I think that there's lots of interesting work happening from lots of indigenous designers who are thinking a lot about kind of sustainable practices that indigenous communities have had for not hundreds but thousands and thousands of years, and looking to those practices and bringing them into a contemporary space. And we're seeing lots of interesting work happening around fabrics like bark cloth, which is one of the oldest cloths in the world, which is the bark of a tree. You know, what happens when we actually start to look at how our ancestors will have been looking after the planet. So I think that might be one of the ways that we might get through some of the environmental challenges that we've got at the moment, which might make it move beyond even local, global, you know, kind of really down to kind of what's happening with the earth and how do we kind of protect our earth, really.
Maybe also talking about adopting like techniques or things that have been there before. It's not quite the same, but you were also before talking about if this Ghanaian designer uses his roots and goes with that into the global market, it's not going to be seen or there's going to be even a problem. How do we navigate with those cultural sensitivities, or how do we avoid misappropriation or maybe also misinterpretation if we work with things that have been there before?
Yeah, I think from a Western point of view, I mean, appropriation was always been like really used and sort of glorified, and obviously it went into a dead end where it can't be done anymore in that way because it's just not possible. But what's happening interesting, because Africa was placed in this situation and not having its own global brands, like for designers to be able to putting their stuff into those things for many, many years. You had Nike, you had Adidas, all these brands coming from the West, pushing their own things into a global thing, but it was basically a Western culture that you were promoting and not a global culture. And I think that created a lot of issues for people working in those places because they were never included. So, and now they're even excluded from doing their own work in a way. So, but what's happening is, if you see with appropriation, it's like the appropriation of Western culture. And I think that's a very interesting space. I think appropriation in that way of like, where Nike's never been in, say, for instance, being officially launched or sold in a lot of like African countries. But the Nike logo appears in different places and it becomes a completely different meaning and a completely different situation. And I think it's taking those kind of like Western symbols, reappropriating them, and then create new meaning. For instance, the way that we would, one example was, we interviewed a lot of surfers in Senegal and realized that a lot of the surfers had a sensibility of animism, which is the belief that everything is alive and has power, which is something that we're all aware of now. Anyway, we know you need to be careful what you buy because it's powerful what you buy. These things have power. And then looking at how it was explored in the graphic design, animism, and you see the work of Mousse Ten, and he was in the 70s creating these eyes on buses in Senegal, and you realize that the eyes was also referenced from mascara that came from Egypt on the packaging, and it was referencing sort of like appropriating other designs. But then I started researching on animism in did African animism influence the world? And you realize when you read all Disney's research and his books that he was completely inspired by animism. And we wouldn't have seen SpongeBob or any of those if it wasn't for animism in Africa. And you realize all of this animation in the world came from this kind of idea in Africa. So then we would go and appropriate Disney images and then rework those images and then use that as African design in an appropriated way, because it makes all the links but comes back to Africa, and in that way Africa then can step up and tell its stories.
Did you get sued?
No, we change it.
But it's true, isn't it, about appropriation, because, so much of it is about the money. And, so these big brands can keep, I don't even think we should call it appropriation, it's theft, isn't it? They keep stealing different ideas, and marginalised groups haven't got the lawyers or anything to fight back. And yet with their one tick, if the one tick is used in any other way, they've got all their lawyers on the case. It's a tick, for God's sake. Yeah. It's amazing how much they can make.
People push things into the global world without, how do you control that? When you put something into the world, you need to know that you can't control it to a certain point. People can create new meanings around stuff, and you can't control those kind of things happening. So there is those kind of things, like why people can't have a new understanding. If this logo appeared out of nowhere on everywhere in a country with no link to a shoe, why people can't use that and start creating their own things? You can't fight that because you've put it out.
We saw it also a lot in Cairo when we had this small residency there. How you see mashups of Nike, Zara, and Gucci on the same shirt, and we found this. That's a very fascinating way how they reappropriate kind of these logos, because they see it in the Western world, but they don't maybe know the meaning of that. It's actually a brand that you support, but more the symbols. So they take the symbols out and place it on buses or on tuk-tuk. What was this one?
Or even that the H&M and Zara logo stands for a retail company, which isn't usually printed or
yeah, exactly.
on the clothes, and they actually take it and print it directly on the cloth, and look what I'm wearing, but also just because of the fact that these fast fashion brands are actually high fashion brands. If you they don't exchange the prices into what we are used to, what a H&M t-shirt costs. So
even H&M in Cairo is kind of not so affordable, so that suddenly becomes something that you want to show, and that's super interesting, of course, because it totally smashes also what we know about meaning, because for us this has a totally different meaning, and I found that very inspiring in the way they use this visual language.
Yeah, and also back to this example of the young boys football Nike collaboration. Of course, we appropriate this brand's pieces because they did a big mistake and couldn't actually, taking it back was just trashing them and just doing new ones. But to realize, okay, we profit somehow a lot by having this logo on our pieces as well. But it's always to measure, how do they appropriate us and our way of life, and how can we appropriate them? And is it in balance? And do the consumer really get what we do, or is it just actually left position person who likes this kind of recycling and alternative way of consuming, but still likes to wear the Nike symbol? It just turned upside down, and then it's a political statement of I actually don't like Nike, but I need to show it. And it's also kind of super interesting and weird, or what we like to play with, that it's in the end valuable to use it and to turn it upside down instead of just cutting it out, because it's like our enemy. We don't want to represent it, but somehow it's always a question.
For me, it's an interesting shift that happened in design, because not long ago, meaning was not very welcome in design. And suddenly there's a lot of realizing that meaning was always there, but now people are prepared to talk about meaning. like, I mean, a lot of Swiss design before, there was no meaning. You know, you can design things, but don't bring your own meaning as a designer. You know, you design something for something, and that's the meaning, but the designer don't add his own meaning. And now that's being added, which I think is kind of almost working against sort of Western design.
Well, we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? The unquestioned kind of aesthetics in design and how everything's, I mean, a lot in fashion is still like, you know, about an asymmetric collar or something like this. And yeah, hopefully there is new generations, I think because of climate change, who are recognising that we need to, it's urgent, we need to be thinking about what we're putting out there. We don't need, I don't know what the stats are, someone told me the other day, like we don't need any more clothes in the world. I mean, there's enough clothes to go around. We could stop manufacturing tomorrow and everyone would still have enough clothes. I think it's something for like 40 years or something. There's so much stuff out there. So what we're gonna do as a community, these are the sorts of questions we should be having, not just, you know, about the aesthetics, and we should be expanding what the aesthetics means so that it includes conversations about the supply chain, about the earth. Like, it's lovely to see the soil in this exhibition to reconnect us with where did it come from and where is it going to go to. It's that whole cycle, because at the moment, the majority of us in this room are wearing mixed fibres, and the likelihood is that it's going to not break down for a few hundred years when it goes back in the soil. So that's the reality, where we're still churning out more of these garments. And the idea then that organic's better is highly problematic as well, as we know, because of the water use and all this stuff. So it's not, you know, sometimes actually it might be better to use 100% synthetic, because that can actually be recycled, the fibres can be reused. So, you know, having those really uncomfortable conversations are important.
How is it in your field, those topics about sustainability and what materials to work with? Is that already a topic?
Yes, it is. Also, I think paper is a problem, because it got super expensive and many paper factories had to close. But even the printmakers we work with, they can't say what it is. And I didn't do some research about it. But I think it also has to do with the resources that they get now, or the whole circulation of the resources. And yeah, so, and in my work, I think as a designer, I don't want to think of making a surface beautiful as a designer. And the first thoughts I have when I do a job, or the first questions are, why do you need that? Why do you want to make a book? Why do you want to make a website? Couldn't it be better to make it this or change it to another media? And because every decision you made as a designer has consequences and takes resources, even it's material or work, also time for other people who work for you or with you. And this is something we try to ask. And we also say to our clients, if you need someone who turns your head off, then we are not the right persons, because we ask questions, and maybe are these questions not so comfortable for clients. Yeah.
Do you know that too from your
Well,
practice?
I was just smiling because I had a conversation with a design educator and researcher, Benedetta Kripa. She's also a graphic designer. She's based in Stockholm. I was very happy to have a talk with her, and she, at the end of the conversation we had, asked me if I'm ready to be alone. And at first I didn't understand what she meant. It's like, yeah, well, you will have to walk out of places a lot of times if you kind of gonna turn your back against certain systems that are implied. And I found it a strong statement. Of course, it's a bit like, but I think it's true. You have to be quite strong-minded to face certain consequences, and only by being consequent and maybe sometimes turning down some things, if you able to do it. Also, it's also a privilege sometimes to turn things down, of course. It depends where you stand in the world, but I think I found it a strong statement, because she said, look, I just have decided to only work with 95% only with women, and not even it's a choice, but it's just because women hire me and men don't want to work with me because they just don't like what I'm doing. So it's also about finding these places where you actually can work towards a more sustainable way, and I think that's positive, because it's something you can work on, and it's not you don't decide from one day to the other, I'm going to be now sustained, because we still live, and this is also a big part of this exhibition, we still strongly acknowledge that we're part of the system of the fashion industry, but then how to work or how to create places where it's possible to at least talk about other ways of doing, and suddenly start to grow a community where something can happen.
Choice is a luxury.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have any other work, any work is good, and that's also a problem,
true.
you know.
Yeah, and it's also a luxury to say no.
Yeah.
I don't do it.
Yeah.
Because wir haben das Heu nicht auf derselben Bühne.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, this is why I think it's so important to. Your dog is so lovely. This is why I think it's so important to, when we're talking about the global supply chain and transparency, to really talk about how much we earn by doing this. So much of this is covered up, and we don't, as a society, really talk about these things. But how difficult it is to make a living as a designer. From a UK context anyway, how it's the cost of living is so much, how London is becoming an unaffordable city. These things should all go into part of how we discuss design. Who gets to be a designer when we're talking about privilege? We're finding more and more in a London context that local students can't actually afford to come and study in the colleges. It's becoming very, very difficult for them because we have in the UK, I think, one of the highest fees for a degree course in the world at the moment, £9,500 a year and that's for home students. So yeah, the more we can really talk about these things, it's really important, because I think what ultimately might happen as well is that as we start thinking, do we need more things? Are we going to turn into courses that are just about repair, about mending things, all of these different ways we might upcycle, remaking, redoing, because we've got the stuff. The design's going to be about how we reuse them rather than from scratch, I think.
Well, I think we also wanted to do a project, we also do marbled objects, and we had the idea to marble erasers. So we tried to find, we had the thought in our head there must be leftovers of these perfect squared erasers, and how can we can find a way to get them and to marble them and make of these leftovers something new. And it was impossible to get someone on a phone who can tell where these erasers were produced, so this is something, or maybe also my question at you, how do you do it? How do you get the connection to these kind of stock things which would go to trash or?
No. I think it's also being consistent in what you communicate towards outside. So I think Nina's I'm not from the beginning part of it, but I'm just talking for the group. But I think from the beginning we have been communicating and interested in this way of working. So I guess like the only people that approach us, they know already what we're doing. And through that, and
so the people come to you
mostly, and I guess like because now you get Switzerland's not so big, so it's also like you get at one point a bit of people know what we are doing, and then chances are there that someone comes with some dead stock. And we have also a good connection to Rework, which is a company that has a workshop in India who are directly involved also with this whole chain supply of second-hand. Nina was there as well. So it's about like, again, like finding these places, and then also, I guess, like being consistent in communicating what you stand for, and at one point, hopefully something comes back. But again, I think like maybe just to open it up again for the global, I think it's very important to say that it is a lot about who can afford also to be in that position, but at the same time also be consistent in trying to do, no matter where you stand. And I think like even, again, Benedetta Kripa said also like, the only people who actually can afford not to be critical are the people in power or are rich people, and people that are difficult on the margin. They have to be critical, they have to fight, because they're actually always in that position to be critical of the things that are, because they want to change something, they need to change something. So I guess like we all are kind of political beings, and I think that's the starting point where you can try, even if you're a small agency. And I guess like when you come from a different place, it's a different approach.
I think it is opening up those spaces, as privileged people, to opening up those spaces for other people in order to make those kind of decisions and to be able to make those decisions. And I think that's a super important thing. But the other thing is also we must remember, and it is very complex, that the world is, like even the waste, like in Nigeria, for instance, 70% of the clothing industry in Nigeria is based on waste that's being dumped there. And we tried to set up a factory to recycle cotton. We can't get hold of the clothes because it's so developed. The sub-economy around waste is so developed that it's becoming very, very difficult to actually stop that thing or to get involved. And if you want to get involved, you really get involved in some dangerous business. So I think it's like the whole world really, and we need to speak also to manufacturers around the world. This conversation needs to start to happen. How are we going to do it differently? It's not only brands from the West doing this, it's also manufacturers doing things on their own for the African market. So there's like, it's very complex. And I think it's a conversation we need to have with everyone all the time. Demanding, consumers needs to be much more demanding. Because at the end, as soon as someone can buy it, it's keeping it alive.
Do you think governments are going to have to step in? Because I think that so much is this kind of neoliberal idea that it's always based on individuals and we need to make choices. It's the same with food, around, but you can buy organic. But the fact is, if you're on a limited income, you can't buy more expensive food. So, but governments could step in. They could ban pesticides and all the food would be organic. Things like that can happen. And I think the same with clothing. So much is always left to small individual brands and people trying to work, when governments could easily step in and say, right, we're going to stop this poor practice. It's all about the ethics, isn't it? We could do this. I mean, do you think that will happen or could happen?
In an ideal world, that's what should happen. But the problem is that governments are there put by politicians who want votes. And if I stop something like a factory or something, they will lose votes. So it's very difficult in poorer countries to help get governments to control those things. The only way that we can really start controlling is making consumers very aware of the issues. I think, I don't know, I know it's very complicated because people have 4 years to get the next vote, and they'll do whatever they want to just get the vote to stay on for the next one. And I think that's the issues that we sit with.
I mean, even here it's complicated. There was a big political campaign too. That's the campaigns that work in foreign countries to control what they're doing, to like throughout the whole supply chain, and it didn't get accepted by the people. So it wasn't, I don't know how to say, but it was the people could vote yes or no, and the majority said no. And I mean, there you see it. It's like it needs more. We can talk about like the political dimension, but they won't act before us. I think before the people. Or I read that in a book that where a guy is like really into post-economics, or how to, it's mainly also about limitation. And he said that the government won't act before the people act. So I guess there still is a need that more people realize, especially here in this like sphere, or in Switzerland, for example, but also like the western part, that we need to change in our way of consumption. And
I also think if we have more brands coming out of Africa that are African owned, that are successful, those things can be influenced by a Western or sort of like a global market that's buying things. And those things can have much more easily have an effect if they're really successful in countries in Africa on their governments, because they're employing a lot of people or they have pressure there to do it. So I think it's also to help provide African companies to succeed. I think that's a very important thing. To create brands coming from Africa, it's important. We need brands from Africa, not only to create jobs for people, but also to tell the good stories about Africa and let Africans tell them. We can't just have a news telling stories from Africa. It doesn't do anyone good. Everyone's got bad. But the only things that we hear from Africa is from news, and we hear from all the good stories from all the brands coming from the rest. And they're just telling how happy the world is and how great it is. And everyone believes that, and that's why they move to America or wherever, because we believe in that dream. And those are told by brands.
Thank you for your contribution. Are there also other thoughts from the public or questions?
Just a question, especially to you. I mean, the climatic breakdown is so obvious, and the ethical aspect of production, socially just production, ecologically just production and design. Where do you see the gaps? Where are the break opens? Because absolutely, just on the individual level, like climate change, it does make a big difference in that. Absolutely leads to governmental interventions or other means of civil disobedience. So, with your students, what is the discussion, or where do you see the gaps to break open to start changing the system?
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. Thank you. I think that for me, my own research, it's been about how knowledge is created. So about the epistemologies, like where does the knowledge of fashion or design, where does it actually emerge? And so if we start to understand why Africa isn't in a typical European design classroom, it's quite easy to understand why that is, because of racism. And students always get really upset when I say I'm racist too, because we are all embedded in a racist system in which Africa is at the bottom and the Europeans at the top. So it's going to, and that's whatever subject we're looking at. So the question is, how do we go about bringing that knowledge into a classroom? And then we can start to really understand that whole design process and how different communities have started from a different starting point in the design process. With animalism, they may start from spirituality as the starting point, a faith base for the starting point. We have quite a conventional design process. We tend to sketch, do a bit of research, sketch something, make something. It's actually really limiting. It doesn't have anything about where the fabric grew, who grows it, what the end of life might be for it. All these things are left out, and then you can start being really creative and think, well, let's start with faith, for example. What happens then? Let's start with the end, so we, like you've been doing, we deconstruct and we go back to the beginning and see what happens then. So I think you can be really creative, but the knowledge and understanding how anti-blackness is at the root of so much of our knowledge systems is so important. So from my own perspective in the classroom, I bring in my own background. My parents are from India, so a South Asian perspective, and I don't say that other people should do that, but everybody's got a starting point, whether it's your gender, your sexuality, your class, your body ableism, maybe you have a hidden disability. But if we could have more transparency between educators and students for us to share and collaborate, we would start to have a very different knowledge base in that classroom that respects everybody's knowledge.
Maybe to add one small thing, I think it's interesting also that especially, I was just thinking back of you visiting the museum in St. Gallen, where you have all these beautiful examples of craft. I think also, especially coming from this Swiss graphic design background, I think there's so much focus on craft, on the outcome based of the form, maybe of the rational way of doing things. And what I learned, I think, I think that's a bit what you were just also pointing on, is like also talk more about the process, about the condition in which this work is produced. And I guess like hearing stories how something is produced, and maybe emphasis more on the process rather than something that you have envisioned in your mind and finish it before you're actually doing it, is I think would set free a lot of energy to tell stories without actually having to produce something at the end that has to be commodified. But maybe just a process, like a talk we have today, could be the work itself. And I think this is kind of something that I've been thinking of a lot lately, and just having conversations with people that is actually the work itself at the end, because you hear stories and you hear about things that you haven't heard of yet.
Yeah, and you learn from each other and not. But this is also these book prizes. I also got like these sheets where the jury judges your book, and there is no point of how was the collaboration, what kind of people were involved in the project. It's all about footnotes, type sizes, leading, and it's a bit behind. So.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about marking criteria, like this really depressing aspect of any education system about how it gets assessed and marked and why it even happens. And it happens because we have a society that's been set up to make us all workers, and we have to have these certificates and so forth. And but how depressing it really genuinely is when you look at the it's so random, it's really arbitrary, that all of these things, and how we're assessing human beings in these categories, and how these categories are based on classification systems about what knowledge is. Knowledge is about academic writing, being able to write well. It doesn't have to be. It's about sewing really well. It doesn't actually have to be. These are things that have been at a certain point in history have been chosen probably by some men somewhere, and we don't have to have it that way. What if you have a totally different assessment system, if people are included, more participatory processes, and I think that's where the fight is, really, to try and bring about these sorts of changes.
But it's not all doom and gloom. I think there's a lot of people are discussing this, and a lot of things are being in place. So I don't think it's like the world is. I think it's actually very positive in a way that this kind of discussions happen, and a lot of people are spending a lot of effort in trying to find better ways of doing things. So I think there's definitely a move much more to that way than going to the other way.
Yeah, totally. Because I look at kind of decolonisation, and often people say, "Oh, that means you're saying we can't look at, this type of design." And I'm like, no, I'm saying expand the shelf. I'm not saying I do actually think it's important from a fashion perspective to understand Paris couture, the traditions of Italian tailoring and so forth. But I'm saying also understand where that juxtaposes with tailoring from Africa, tailoring from the Caribbean, tailoring from India. What happens when those books aren't written, but really in the libraries we have 1% of knowledge, and it's all been curated by publishers who have their limited perspective and so forth. So let's open it up, and then it gets super exciting.
Yeah. I was saying to Dimitri also earlier, we need to break this idea away that there's something like African design or European design or Swiss design. We need to talk about design, and there's many things that you can know about it, and many places where you can learn from it, and it's not just a center in one place. And that idea that international design is right from here, it doesn't really exist. It comes from many places, from many things. And I think we need to throw it completely open, talk about design, and that means it includes African design and design from everywhere.
The biggest demographic in London at the moment are young people who are of dual or more heritage. So my children are in that category, and in one of my kids' classes at school, of 30 children, 19 have parents who are from different heritages, of which many have parents, like one of my children's best friends, one parent is of dual heritage, another parent, they're growing up speaking 2-3 languages at home. This is going to be the generation coming through now who are not going to be dictated to by the boundaries of geographies, even though they're growing up as borders are becoming tighter. But that's the reality for them. They have so many points that they're looking at, and they're definitely, going to be addressing anti-blackness, and they know the languages. They're growing up seeing how that manifests in their curricula, what they're learning at school.
Some other questions or? Yeah, because otherwise I think that's a really nice, not the end, but Zwischenhalt to have for our discussion now. And maybe also one of the strongest sentences in the exhibition from NCCFN comes from that local global topic. It's the top sentence there where it says, "Those products have traveled probably more than you." That really stayed with me. And if the schools are coming, we always ask the children to have a look at this little label to see where it's really made, and we ask them, have you been there? And this is always a really nice moment to have this this moment to think about places and where am I and what happens there. So I think maybe if you have time and want to do that afterwards, and we can exchange our thoughts a bit later also in the bar El Gato Muerto, that is open just behind there from Barbara Ziegler and Michael Bonnemann. And after that at 5 o'clock in the Erdgeschoss there is the platform 3 to the topic Heimat als Ort und Erfahrung. So in that sense, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you all very much. And
thank you. Thank you.